All right. Assalamu alaikum, guys. I pray and I hope that you guys are having a fantastic break. Um, we're going to talk on chapter 14, economic transformation, commerce, and consequences. We're going to do this chapter in two parts. I was going to do some Zoom classes over the break, but I decided against it. I decided that I'm just going to present this information to you guys, and then yeah. So I presented the information to you guys, and then I want you to comment. This will be posted on YouTube, and for you guys to comment on any questions that you have. And I'm going to ask some questions as we go on of the CPQs with a different twist. So first and foremost, we're talking about the economic transformation. This is mainly focusing on Europe and the Americas, what we know of as mercantilism, what I introduced to you guys before we left. This mercantilism is the beginning of using gold and silver bullion as ways and methods of payment. And we talked about some of the benefits of gold and silver as compared to crops and other goods. Everyone around the world loves that shiny material, right? Whether it's gold or silver, it's coveted all over the world. So as far as the Europeans, which if we remember, we have the isolationist mentality and policies of China in the East. And in Central Asia, we have the Ottoman Empire and the Muslims, which is kind of causing the Europeans to be kind of boxed in trade, right? And they have no access because the materials that were being presented by the Europeans at this time were not coveted around the world. So this is the importance of mercantilism and the importance of the European countries, Spain, Portugal, England, the Dutch, of gaining access to this gold and silver because it allows for them to reintroduce themselves into the trade, okay, specifically in the East. Okay, so if we're going through the Strayers, chapter 14, we're going to begin on page 670, and you guys follow along with me as we go, right? So the first section that we have here is the European and Asian commerce, and this is what this was touching on. The Europeans being boxed in. Remember, at this point in time, with the fall of Constantinople and the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition, there is a serious conflict in Eurasia Afro-Eurasia actually, between the Muslims in the East and in the South and the Europeans in the West. And because of this conflict, the Europeans they're losing access to the trade routes, okay? They're losing access. So this is an issue when you talk about European commerce. So they have to find another way to gain access to the Indias, to the Srivijaya, to the islands of the Pacific Rim, okay? And this is what leads us to, or the Europeans to, traveling west in this idea of reaching the East from the West. And this is what creates this interaction between the Europeans and the natives or the Taino natives of the Americas. Okay, so we understand. So the question, the CPQ question is that what drove European involvement in the world of Asian commerce, right? And so it's the need for the products that are being produced in the East, okay? The scientific ideas, the technological advances, the spice, the more defined, I'm sorry, pardon me, there's somebody, okay, they're viewing the house next door. The more defined or refined products in the East, right? So this is what is driving the Western people, the Europeans, to get into the trade, right? But as we know, we talked upon before, the isolationist policies of China, not wanting any of the goods, not wanting any of the social ills, not wanting any of the Christianity that Europeans are presenting to them, and they lock down their borders, right? And this creates a crisis with the Europeans, because now there's conflict in the East. There's conflicts with the Muslims. What are they going to do? Okay, and so of course you have the Chinese. I could almost say Chinese superiority philosophy, right? Where the Chinese say that, what we have is enough. We don't need what you have, right? You are desirous of what we have. We are not desirous of what you have. Okay. So this is very important. As we turn the page, we say a Portuguese empire of commerce, right? And remember what we talked about in chapter 13, there's two different kinds of empires, right? You have colonial empires that come from another part of the world, and then they begin to take over the land, okay? And then there's trade route empires, right? And so the trade route empires are where Europeans come into the Indian Ocean per se, and they set up trading ports, or, where they trade at the ports to the people, the native people, and the native people take those goods inland and trade them amongst the people. Okay. And so those are the two different types of empires. Now, one empire, a colonial empire, it's based around violence. Let's just be honest, right? I'm going to come into your land and I'm going to take over your land. Or let's put it in a understanding of what we have today, right? I'm going to come into your home and I'm going to take over your home. I'm going to colonize your home, right? Now, I would hope that if I was to attempt to colonize your home, that you would fight me, right? And so we understand in the West, they had advancements of warfare, right? The advancements of metallurgy, the advancements of armaments, okay? So with that, and you could almost say the naivety of the indigenous people, especially in the islands of the Pacific Rim, right? The Europeans, the Dutch, in this case here, the Portuguese, are able to come into those lands and take over, right? They're able to take over. And then from there, they're able to set up large trading empires in the Pacific Islands, right? Really touching upon taking over the Srivijaya maritime empire, and then we're going to see the Spain going into the Philippines, renaming it after their king, and taking over the people here and colonizing their land. And then we're going to see the Dutch create trade port empires, right, or trade route empires along the Indian Ocean, right, along Southeast Asia, on the east coast of Africa, and then eventually those trade route empires are going to be solidified. Those ports are going to be turned into forts. Okay, so this is very important. So what we talked about here is the notes that I've taken is that the Europeans begin to weaponize, right? What does that mean? The Europeans begin to weaponize their ships using the technology of the East, the gunpowder, right? They mount the cannons on the ships, and now from the water, they are able to safely bombard, right? These existing indigenous people in these islands. So, understanding how difficult this becomes for many people, right? In these islands that, we've never seen technology such as this that we can be fired upon from vast distances away, right? So this is what gives the Portuguese advancements in this region. Again, it says with Chinese isolation, the Portuguese took over the Indian Ocean trade using advanced technology and extreme force. Okay, the book talks about that they didn't spare man, woman, or child in certain regions of the Indian Ocean. Okay, and with the massive maritime fleet of the Chinese, which would dwarf that of the Portuguese or that of the Spanish or that of the Dutch or that of the English weren't really in this area at the time, right? They would vastly dwarf them, but with the Chinese isolationists, it leaves a huge void, which was filled by the Europeans. So Portuguese took over the Indian Ocean trade route for about 100 years, and this is requiring tribute of the empires, also paying a tax of any other ships that come into this region. And so what this does is that this really creates a massive monetary empire of the Portuguese, okay, based off of their gaining access into the Indian Ocean. Okay, eventually this Portuguese trade route empire folded into the natural Indian Ocean trade. The Portuguese assimilated into the local culture. All right. So eventually, as what to happen, we saw this with the Mongol Empire as they began to take over Central Asia. The people began to assimilate with the culture. The Mongol Empire, many of the Mongols converted to Islam, and you see the Pax Mongolica, and the people begin to just assimilate, right? And this is just who we are, right? That's what happened to the Portuguese Empire. So by 1600, the Portuguese lost control of the, what does it say here? Okay, the Portuguese, by 1600, the Portuguese had lost control of the trade route in the Indian Ocean, and this opened up the door for the Spanish to come in. So the Spanish enter into the Indian Ocean trade route after seeing the success of their neighbors. Remember, in the Iberian Peninsula, what we know of today as Spain and Portugal, right? They're neighbors, they're side by side. You know, they see small, or the Spanish see small Portugal creating a huge empire, right? So they're like, okay, we can do what they're doing, right? And the Spanish begin to come into the Indian Ocean, and they take the lands of the Srivijayan Empire, right? And they turn the Srivijayan Empire into what we know of today as the Philippines, right? And they held the Philippines all the way up until the Spanish-American War of 1819, which we will cover on later on in the year when we talk about the American imperialism. The point of this takeover, taking over the Srivijayans, it was a relatively bloodless conflict, right? It was a takeover by, how can we say, it was a takeover of tribute, right? A takeover of tribute and giving them, as they would say, civilization, or giving them Christianity, right? And of course, you know, it's the concept, like I mentioned in class sometimes, it's the get down or lay down. You know, you either get down with the program that we have for you because we have massive military strength, or we're going to lay you down, right? So the Srivijayans have to look at the situation and say, hey, this is what's best for us to save us and our people. We will still be enriched. We'll still have some money. So we're going to pay tribute to the Spanish, right? So now, very important, in Srivijaya, right? Even if we say today, like Indonesia is 90% Muslim. In Srivijaya, in these islands of the Pacific Rim, there were still Muslims. So there was still that Muslim Christianity conflict from Central Asia, right? Central Asia, Eastern Europe, had now came over into the Indian Ocean island, right? So there was still that conflict of Christianity and Muslim, right? So that's very important that we look into. So once established, Spain began to implement their culture on the Filipinos, which now they're called the Srivijayan Empire. We'll call them Filipinos now, the people of the Philippine Islands. So there, as we see, whenever there is a transfer of religion, especially if you're talking about Confucius-led or Buddhist-led, there begins to be less gender equality in their culture. There begins to be a more rigid, a loss of freedom and equality in that culture, right? As the Spanish introduced Christianity, there is that loss, okay? So we understand that now this begins to change the culture of in the Philippines, okay? Moving it away from a more dominant Buddhist, a more dominant Muslim. So now you're starting to have Christianity come in. Many Filipinos fled to the capital Manila, where they had more diversity. Hostiles arose between Spaniards and Chinese. So we know that there was Chinese isolationists, you know, but there were still Chinese traders throughout Srivijaya, and we start to see conflict. And this conflict between the Chinese and the Christians, it just further exemplifies why the Chinese are going to become more isolationist for the next 100 years or next several hundred years. So knowing what it's saying, the people of the country in the Philippines, right, they traveled to the cities and they left the countries to be taken over by the Spaniards, right? And so that's what's going on in the Philippine Islands as Spain has entered into the mix, right? So now we're going to talk about, if we're on page well, let's go back and let's look at these CPQs. Okay, so the next CPQ here is, how did the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British initiate the Asian in Asia differ from one another, right? So this is touching on the different ways in which the Europeans came into the Pacific Rim and began to take over, right? We talked about that. We talked about some came with force, some came with religion, some came with tribute, some came with just trade, right? We have to know who came with what. Some came with implementing the slavery, right? Forced labor. Okay. So, but to know that the Europeans did come into they did come into the Pacific Rim, into the East, with different techniques of governance. Okay, different techniques of governance. All right, so we have the East India country. I'm sorry, the East Indian companies. And what is this? This is now, right, creating big business out of trade. Okay, big business out of trade. And so what this is talking about is that in the Dutch Empire, and the British, right, they enter into East Indian trading companies. These are companies that are funded by the governments, right? Even though the money goes to individuals, the government offers the individuals massive amounts of money to grow their fleet, right? In hopes that well, not in hopes, but with the guarantee that many of the profits that come from these exploits into the East are going to be brought back and enriches the country. Okay, of course, enriching that person as well, but they're gonna have to pay a certain tax, a certain due that's going to enrich the country, right? So this is what is touching on the East Indian trading company, right? And so the Dutch, or I'm sorry, the English and the Dutch, right, greatly changed Asian society. The Europeans set up trade ports, empires along the Indian Ocean. At times, interaction was business, other times violent. To gain control of the trade routes, the Dutch once killed over 1,500 people, right? Men, man, woman, and child, right? So again, right, trade, or this becomes big business. Dominating people becomes big business, okay? And we'll see, as we talked about before we left in the Europe, in the Americas, right, that it appears to be that the British and the Dutch are far more violent, right? They're far more violent than the Spanish and the and the Portuguese, you know, and we touched upon, you know, the creation of mestizos, mestizas, and mulatto, and how certain groups of people were given status in society where other groups of people were not given status in society, right? And were actually put on the lowest ebb of the social hierarchy, where others were given some status. Specifically speaking about the mestizos, the mestizas were given some status, more status, while the mulattoes were put on the lowest ebb of the society, along with the enslaved people, right? So we do see that social hierarchical issue. The British attempted the same force that the Dutch did, but did not have success. They made agreement with the Mughal authorities to set up trade ports in India, creating a new coastal city, right? So this is important because we're going to see eventually the fall of the Mughal Empire, but this is the first interaction between the British and the Mughal Empire, right? Creating, you know, a tribute system, creating a symbiotic, a dually beneficial trade system, right, between the British and the Mughal Empire. But again, like I mentioned before, these port cities are eventually going to be turned into fort cities, and those fortified cities are going to be used to take over, right? So you have to be very, very, very careful. These trade ports have been extremely beneficial for the English and the Dutch, and eventually led to colonization, as I talked about. Okay, Asian. We are on page 677. Asian commerce, right? These are the Asians in Asia and how they are dealing with this new introduction of these new groups of people in the maritime trade, right? Okay, though the Europeans played a large role in trade and the commerce in America and Africa, the Europeans had much less significance in these parts, apart from the Spanish control in the Philippines and a few formal Srivijaya and Spice Islands, and the Eastern Empire's rule of the Indian Ocean trade. So what this is talking about here, even though we're talking about the trade that entered into the Pacific Rim, right? It is notable to say that trade in that area was still predominantly controlled by the Muslims. You still have the Swahili, Arab, African influences on East Africa. You have the Mughal Empire, and you still have a large Muslim contingent of people in the quote unquote Srivijayan Empire, now being introduced as the Philippines, right? But there's still massive, even though there's still massive Muslim and Europe and Asian influence, right? So I don't know how to break it down, but percentage wise, but in my opinion, from what I've read, I'd probably say it was 75-25, right? 75% of the trade was still controlled by Asians, right? And 25% of it will be controlled by the Europeans, right? But as we see, and history is going to tell us, those numbers are going to drastically change in the coming centuries. Okay, let's see here. Let's continue on, right? Asia and the Asian empires, when the Europeans entered Japan, they found a feudal system plagued by war. So now we're going to talk about the Europeans coming in Japan and the feudal system. We talked about the feudal system in Europe at the time. Asia had their strict feudal system, right? At the top of the feudal system, of course, is the emperor, right? And then you have underneath those, you have daimyos, which are kind of like local governors, right? And each of the daimyos have their own fighting force, what we know of as the samurai, right? And the samurai protect the land of the daimyo, and so in Japan at the time when the Europeans came to Japan, they saw this strict feudal system, and they saw introduced into the samurai, right? And like I've talked about in class, it has been very dangerous for people to land on the Japanese coast, right? Because, like I said, it's been the concept that if you land on the Japanese coast, you landed on the wrong coast. They didn't want to talk. They didn't want to, as I say, violence, right? They don't want to talk. What are you here for, right? Again, more isolations on this island, right? Just like we talked about the Mongols' attempt to take over Japan, but they were too far away for there to be any significant interaction between the Mongols and the Japanese, right? But the Japanese were able to hold their own, okay? They were able to hold their own. All right, so let's continue here. What does it say? Despite European advancements in naval technology, local traders did not disappear. Regional trade giants continued. As we said, the Asians continued to take over or control. The trade network did grow. Women were encouraged to participate in trade. Traders from various religions and cultures interacted wonderfully, right? So this is what we're talking about in Asia by the Asian, right? That women were able, right, to have some justice. And a lot of this, again, China and the Confucius ideology becomes isolations. They pull themselves out, right? But you do see amongst the people of the Pacific Islands, you see in the Muslim lands that were controlled, that women were given the ability to trade, right? Women were given status based on the products of how well their products can be produced. So we do see that women are given an opportunity for social and for economic growth, right? And this changes their cultural standing, okay? So let's see here. We have silver and global commerce, right? And we touched on this silver and global commerce. So we begin to see that silver deposits are found in Bolivia, right? In South America. They are also found in Japan, right? And this finding of silver completely changes, right? It completely changes the trade practices of across Eurasia, right? Across Eurasia. And the amount of silver that a given empire had, it really affected their dominance, right? And so this is what prompts the Europeans to go into the Americas and to enslave the people and to send them into the silver mines, because we needed to get more of this silver, right, to gain access more into the trade routes. Okay, and this finding of the silver in Japan is going to attract, right, Europeans to Japan as well, because this gives us the need for silver, right? So silver was the first direct and sustained link between the Americas and Asia, right? It initiated a web of Pacific commerce, right? Very, very, very important, right? Very important. And this is what is creating this concept of mercantilism, right? Mercantilism. Again, very important for us to know this for the exam, right? Mercantilism. The use of silver and gold bullion to enter into trade routes. Okay, next, I'm going to stop right here on page 682. And the second part of this, we're going to talk about the world hunt fur in the global commerce, right? How fur connected the Americas to how fur connected the Americas. I'm sorry, guys, my wife just walked in, and alhamdulillah. That's alhamdulillah. It's wonderful. Yeah, but fur connecting the Americas, a central part of America, to the fur trade, or the fur, how can I say, it's not trade, what's the word I'm looking for? Demand, right? Demand. And I told you guys when I was a kid, you know, how my grandmother and my mother, everybody had fur, and there was a large demand for fur amongst that generation, right? And so we see in especially in Russia, in colder weather, this want for fur cat hats and for fur jackets and fur gloves and scarves, and you know, and this fur trade brings the Americas, right, into world trade as well, right? I guess I said we're going to stop there, but I'm explaining it. So we're just going to continue on, and I'm going to stop at this next point. So it's very important. The fur trade, it did bring some benefit, including the trade of pelts, right? It's the pelts is what it's called. It also had a negative impact, such as exposing Native Americans to European diseases, right? So to get those furs, right, the Americas, it's not, again, this is the same concept that we have to get out of our mind when it talks about slavery, right? That Europeans came to Africa and went into the interior of Africa and captured people. That's completely false, right? The enslaved prisoners of war were brought to these trading posts, and and captured prisoners of war were traded for other goods, hence becoming slaves, right? At that point in time, right? And so it's the same concept with the fur trade, right? It wasn't like the Europeans were going into these regions and you know, killing these animals and bringing the pelts out. That's not true. The Native Americans were killing these animals. They were tanning the hide, and they were bringing the pelts to the Europeans, and the Europeans were you know, enriching them in the same process. With, I don't know if you really want to call it enriching them, right? We were giving them products just like the Europeans were giving the Africans products, right? And through that, this empire began to grow. Okay, so that's very important. Let's see here. So there was both a positive and negative. So when the natives of the interior interacted with these Americans, there was there was disease, the Great Dying. We talked about this before, right? The Great Dying. And then with the Great Dying, you see more influence of Europeans and less influence of Native people. Okay, now, guys, this is where we're going to stop, right? As we begin to talk about on page 687, Commerce and People, the transatlantic slave trade. As these new opportunities arise, there has to be a workforce, right, to keep the machine running, right? And yeah, when we get back, we're going to talk about the workforce, the slave workforce. So let's see here. So the question that I want you guys to answer in the chat, right, or is what differences in the operation and impacts of the spice, silver, and fur trades can you identify? So in the comments, I want you to give me both a positive and a negative of the spice trade, the silver trade, and the fur trade. Okay. Now, of course, this isn't a quiz, but this is just me making sure that you guys are paying and watching the video. All right. Again, hope that you guys are staying warm. I can't wait to see you guys on Tuesday. On Tuesday, Wednesday, I don't know. I have to look at the schedule, but I'm excited to get this second half of the school year going and prepare us for an exam on May 11th. All right. All right, guys. Inshallah, I will see you guys later. Assalamu alaikum.